I'm Steve Coll. I'm the author of Private Empire, ExxonMobil American Power. Wear lots of other hats too, but that's the main one at the moment. The book is a kind of investigative narrative history of ExxonMobil and its place in public life here and abroad from the time of the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989 through to basically the present day. It took some doing to try to understand what mattered at this company and why it matters to us. And one of the transformational events in its own life was that spill. It destroyed their reputation overnight. It led to a series of pretty radical reforms inside the company on a never again basis. One of the conclusions I came to about ExxonMobil was that it was useful to think of it as a kind of independent sovereign state spread around the world. And if you think of it as a country, the Valdez spill was kind of a 9/11 event for them. So they really overreacted to some extent, but also were galvanized through and through by that accident. I didn't go in a straight line to this book. I have been working on subjects that have to do with America's sort of asymmetric power in the world, particularly in a post-9/11 setting. And after doing the book before this one, which was basically about modernization in Saudi Arabia and all of the complicated ways that Saudi society produced not just Osama bin Laden, but his 53 brothers and sisters who had wildly different sources of global identity. I came out of that book about Saudi Arabia and I really wanted to write about oil. And oil in an age of limits, oil in an age of contest, oil as a proxy for America's place in the world, as a source of struggle. I had been inspired as a younger journalist by The Prize by Dan Jurgen, which is a large historical, well-reported narrative. It's sort of about oil in the age of expansion and discovery, and I wanted to write about oil in an age of limits and change. So I actually started out this book without ExxonMobil as the particular focus, and I was going to write a wider narrative about America and oil in the modern era. And I got out into the field about 6 months, and I thought, I really need a company to tell this story properly. I'm too spread out. So once I made that decision, then ExxonMobil was the only logical choice because they're the largest corporation headquartered in the United States. They receive very little scrutiny. They have a very strong culture, a very particular sense of themselves. They're a very closed institution, which makes them both difficult to report on and kind of intriguing as a project. And so off I went. And as I got going, I would just say that I was very glad that I had chosen them because they're a very powerful subject in lots of ways. But also, I came to think of the book a little bit differently than when I started out. I came to think of it as a case study of corporate sovereignty and power in our political economy and in the world's political economy. We live in a time when I think governments matter less, and non-governmental entities are rising in importance. Technological change is a factor, globalization is a factor. And in the United States, corporations are more influential, I would argue, than at any time since the Gilded Age. You can measure this statistically. Corporate income relative to household income, relative to small business income is greater than it's been at any time since people started keeping statistics about such things. And we know intuitively, whether you're coming at it from the Tea Party or the Occupy side, that income inequality is related to the role that corporations play in our politics and the degree of industry capture that's emerged in sections of our government. And so if that's the context, well, ExxonMobil is a very interesting example because their revenue last year was greater than the economic activity of most countries in the world. But as journalists, we don't really scrutinize them very much. Mostly that they were a very closed institution, very disciplined. They don't volunteer to be written about. They didn't want to be written about here. I it's my professional life to write about hard subjects, so I have a method. But even as I applied my method, I found that their walls were thicker, and they were just a tighter subject. Now, there are ways you can break down a corporation like ExxonMobil as a reporter. In this society, one example is court records, which they sue a lot of people. They get sued by a lot of people. Some of those cases go to trial. The records that are generated there, the testimony that is generated there, while selective, can be very revealing, and there are some trial narratives in the book that help go down layers of depth that it wouldn't be possible for me to do without their cooperation while interviewing. I also filed extensive Freedom of Information Act requests with the United States government, looking at places abroad where I knew they operated and where I knew the country was troubled. So there had to be an interesting story there. So it was a little bit like throwing a message in a bottle into the State Department and other sections of the government, asking for cables that would describe ExxonMobil's activity in periods of violence in Aceh, Indonesia, for example, in Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, and those efforts actually, over time, yielded very, very strong material. And then I interviewed. I interviewed as many people as I could find. I approached the company directly. They provided a limited amount of background cooperation. I came later to understand that they probably thought they were being exceptionally cooperative, but my experience was that it was helpful, but pretty limited. Yeah, there's a kind of outside-in process that's a little bit like that, and I try to. What I feel like I've learned just as a journalist over 30 years of doing this is that there's really no one method. You kind of have to do everything. If the target is really hard, if it's really hard, you just have to surround it with every method of effective reporting that you know how to conduct. You do them all simultaneously, and then follow the threads that open up. And outside in, though, that notion of interpolating your way forward is the basic framework. There are moments when a door opens and you go straight in, and you stay in that hallway or that room that you've gotten into until you've emptied it, and then you try to find another door to go through. If you don't, you back out and look for another way. Well, it's mostly interview breakthroughs are the big serendipitous kind of mapping aspects. There are lots of ways to try to approach people to ask them to help you, even if the corporation's official position is we're not cooperating. So you look for people who are former executives or who may not be afraid to talk about the company. One thing that was particularly difficult about ExxonMobil is that it's a very comfortable place to work if you can abide their rules and their culture. It's a place where many people stay for life. They have an excellent defined benefit pension plan, and they tie everyone up with non-disclosure agreements that are tied to the retirement benefits. So people really feel like they have skin in the game. If they're accused of violating the non-disclosure agreements, they could put their entire retirement at risk. So that makes people cautious in a way that you wouldn't normally find. But look, I wasn't asking anyone to turn over their secret sauce or business secrets. I was just asking them to talk about matters of public accountability and business strategy in a country that has the First Amendment to protect your speech. So I would do my best to persuade people. It's a good question because other corporations in their position manage their position differently by trying to have a proactive communication strategy, really recognizing that not everyone is going to see the world as they would wish, but recognizing that if a reasonably balanced, credentialed professional approaches them, whether they're from a journalistic organization or a university or an industry group, and asks for understanding that some corporations say, oh yeah, let's get going. Let's tell you how we see the world. Well, ExxonMobil has a very different view. They basically take all of their decisions on the basis of strict financial interests. And and that's a little bit of an overstatement, but not a lot. And when they think about their communication strategy and their press strategy, I think rather than following some theory that they generally benefit from explaining themselves, or that they have a responsibility to the communities where they operate, the country where they're headquartered, to be an active participant in public life. Rather than that, they ask themselves, what are the cost-benefit equations of cooperating with people like that? And I think the answer that they come to is the costs are higher than the benefits because they operate in controversial settings. They knew that I was interested in their operations in West Africa, where they produced 25% of their oil and gas liquids in the decade after 2000. It's not a pretty picture. Some of the host regimes that they work with have pretty terrible human rights records, or the populations that surround their operations are living in pretty bad conditions. And they might wish for West Africa to be a better place than it is. It would be good for business and good for the people who live there. They're not against that, but they're there as the guests of these host regimes. And if they start telling their story, they're more likely to irritate their host government than they are gain anything in the eyes of, say, American readers about how sophisticated they are. Yeah, well, when I first started, one of the first things I did was travel to West Africa, because once I kind of mapped out where their oil and gas holdings were and where my interests were likely to lie, I thought West Africa would be an important part of the story. So I went out. Chad was one of the places I visited and worked. And as I was going around the country and trying to understand ExxonMobil's presence there, the biggest question I had is, why are they here? Why are they here at all? Because this is an enormous corporation with deep financial resiliency. And here's Chad, really the bottom of the world tables in quality of life indicators. Life expectancy is still under 50 years. So it's not even, Nigeria looks like Holland by comparison. And so the answer as to why they're there, why they gravitate to an environment like that, is actually of real importance. And it has to do with the basic dilemmas that they face in their business. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, a company like Exxon didn't even bother to count up how much oil and gas it owned in the world, because it owned so much. They had a piece of Saudi Aramco, which meant they owned Saudi Arabia's bounty. They had a piece of the Iranian National Oil Company, the Iraqi National Oil Company. And they were producing the big pools of safe oil in a production sense, easy to market, and at least at the time, politically stable. In the 1970s, resource nationalism and expropriations threw them out of all of these big pools of safe oil. And they basically started to face a dilemma they'd never faced before, which is how to replace the oil that they pump and sell each year so that they don't shrink, because their whole business model is based on ownership. They're not a service company. They're not like someone you hire to renovate your house. They want to own the oil and gas in the ground. That's how Wall Street values them. And they produce 4.5 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent a day. Multiply that times 365 days, that's 1.5 billion barrels they've got to find every year just to stay even. Now, once they got thrown out of the Middle East because of nationalism and anti-colonial attitudes, and those attitudes spread all over the world in post-colonial societies, there really were not that many places they could own oil and gas anymore. They could own it in the free market West, where property rights are sacrosanct, North America, Australia, and Europe, but there's not much oil and gas there anymore. It's all been pumped out and used. And that drove them basically into weak states. That's why they're in Africa, because these are states that are too weak, do not have the national capacity to assert their own nationalism over oil. In most of the Arab world, foreign corporations are not allowed to own oil because there's a national attitude that this is a special national resource. It's not like any other property. It belongs to our people. It's a source of national pride. We're not giving it to Exxon. And in Chad, I would imagine some of that same sentiment if it could come forward is probably present in the minds of Chadians, but they don't have a government that could do it themselves, which is what the Middle Eastern governments did. They built their own strong national oil companies. They operate and they own the oil. They hire Westerners for technical service support the way we would hire a contractor to renovate our house, but they do not allow the contractor to own the oil. In Chad, basically, they can't build such a national oil company, so they invite ExxonMobil in and they say, look, will you pump it out of the ground? We'll let you own some of it too. We'll split it 50-50. So ExxonMobil ends up in these weak states where they can actually own the oil and gas in the ground. And these are large reserves, especially Nigeria and Angola. So that's why they're there. And the irony is that this kind of map of the way the world looks to them and the imperative of constantly replacing the reserves they produce every year is driving them into settings of instability. And here's this company that's very rule-bound, very rigid, very focused on trying to wring all risk out of their daily operations to the extent engineers can figure out how to do it. But their business model is driving them into risk. So they're in countries that are much more unstable than they would like, but they have no choice but to be there. Yeah, no, I mean, I think they would wish to be in more stable places for the reasons you cite. And um, but as they would put it, we have to go where the oil is. Well, you have to go where the oil is and you can own it, and that takes you to Chad. But I think what you say is correct. The one thing that's so striking in Chad is very vivid there, but it's true in other countries where they operate. They're now operating in Papua New Guinea, for example. In the most poor societies where they work, their influence is so outsized that it really changes the equation. Chad, for example, when this agreement that Chad put together with the World Bank and the Clinton administration and ExxonMobil facilitated it, ultimately didn't sign up as a party to the agreement to use their oil revenues to promote social development goals. And then that deal fell apart in 2006, and Idris Deby, the president, basically bought his way out of the World Bank obligations by repaying loans early. Now, he could do that because in that year, 2006, 2007, ExxonMobil's tax and royalty revenue to Chad was in the order of $750 million a year. That's basically 1/4 of the national budget, all in, for 11 million people. And it's by comparison, the United States government's embassy in Chad that same year was doling out a maximum of about $10 million in aid. So, if you're Deby and you look across the Capitol and you see the embassy on the one hand and ExxonMobil's country representative office, who actually represents American Power, theoretically the embassy could call in the Marines, I suppose, in a way that ExxonMobil could not. But otherwise, ExxonMobil is the government, and in the South, they really are a much more powerful representative of sovereignty, order, and development strategy than either the state of Chad or any other aid government that's trying to provide aid. That is true, and I think it's a problem myself. They don't, but I think what they would say is that their core competency is oil and gas production. They're not an international aid agency. They wouldn't be a good one if they tried to be. They're not a charitable organization. They do give to charity, but in a measured way. Their view is that the best way to let market forces lead West Africa out of poverty is for ExxonMobil to stick to the things it does well, produce oil and gas profitably, pay its law-abiding taxes and royalties to the host governments in copious amounts, and let those host governments figure out how to govern their own people, and not to have ExxonMobil get into the business of substituting for their role just because they're weak. If they're weak, then other governments should be helping those governments come forward, et cetera, et cetera. So that's their kind of argument. We're just here to do the thing that we know how to do, and we produce revenue that other people should use to achieve these worthy goals. We're not saying the goals aren't worthy. We're just saying they're not our goals. Yeah, they do some of that because they give, about I think in the most recent year, 0.5% of their total net profits to charity, and some of that flows into the countries where they operate in West Africa, and the projects they do are, well selected in some cases. Malaria eradication, Equatorial Guinea is certainly a good thing for them to be involved in with others, and they work with NGOs and those kinds of charitable things. But what they don't do is show long-term leadership of the sort that they show where their business interests or that are on the line, or leadership comparable to the Gates organization. I mean, the Gates Foundation says, these are our goals, millennium goals or health goals. We're going to invest and show leadership, bring other partners to the table. We're going to insist that we move the needle, and if we try one road and doesn't work, we're going to shift and go in another direction. We're going to get there because these are long-term and deeply important goals, and we're committed to them. ExxonMobil could articulate that. And my view is that it's fine to have a normal corporate responsibility charity profile in many environments where ExxonMobil works. Let their shareholders and their employees debate whether their rate of giving at less than 1% is acceptable to them when Walmart's doing 5% and Target's doing 7%. Okay, those are retail companies. Maybe that's best seen as marketing. But in any event, they're in the game, and there's in most settings, they can, I think, defend their record of social investments and employee risk. But it's a very good place to work. Maybe they're not as generous on the charitable side. However, in my view, there are some settings where they come of their own free will to Chad to make money pumping oil out of the ground. If they would drive out of their fenced compounds and out of their security perimeters and go down these seasonal muddy roads and see the conditions that people are living in with life expectancy of 50 years, and recognize that they are the international power in Chad as the lead operator of this consortium, more influential than the United States government, probably more influential than the French. And they're in a position where they have the organizational strengths to achieve complicated targets. That's what they do. I mean, they could say, you know what, standard operating procedure just isn't good enough in Chad. When life expectancy is under 50 years and we've been here 10 years and we have made X millions of dollars for ourselves, it's just not good enough. We're going to have to do something. In some of these settings, we're going to have to do more because we're here. And I think other corporations do start with that premise. It doesn't make it easy to achieve something, but I find it unpersuasive, ExxonMobil's idea that, well, we're not very good at that. Actually, they're the most efficient, best organized institution of any kind inside Chad's borders. So if they wanted to show leadership to say, all right, these are the things we think we can achieve. We can lead the international community to build the following number of rural health clinics and make sure they're staffed with well-trained nurses and rotating doctors. And we are going to commit ourselves to take a leadership role, not the sole provider, but we're going to get international aid organizations, international governments, NGOs, and others. We're going to get everybody rowing in the same direction. We're going to set targets, and we're going to deliver change in these communities. They could do that. It wouldn't be that expensive either. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they both strands of the original Standard Oil mission are present at Exxon, and there are many people in the business who will say that of all the baby standards that evolved out of the 1911 breakup, Exxon has always been closest to the parent in its culture and its sense of itself. The most rigid, the most conservative, the most influenced still by religiosity in the workplace and in the culture of the corporation, and also the most hardline, the most ruthless, the most inclined to play hardball the way Rockefeller did before he entered his philanthropic phase. And so you can still see this sense of conservative religious mission present in the corporation's outlook on the world, but they remain ideologically committed to capitalism above all else. And I mean, the current chief executive, Rex Tillerson, who was the son of a mid-level Boy Scout administrator in Texas and grew up in an East Texas town, a very Boy Scout-driven and religious household. His mother was also deeply religious, and he's now very active in the Boy Scouts of America and active in his church and in the Republican Party. All of that would be okay. That's a corporate Texas life, except he recently told Scouting Magazine that his favorite book is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, and you think, okay, right now where the colors are getting a little bit shaded over on another side, and so I think there is this real ideology that has been born of their conflicts in the last 20, 30 years with regulators, the environmental movement, Greenpeace, the media. They live in a kind of strategic defensive crouch. They hold on to their original kind of Baptist culture, but they also are really mad at their enemies, and they see the government as hostile to them. They see many other forces in society as not willing to give them a break or to understand who they are, and that I think has impeded their potential to evolve in these directions, whether it was influenced by the Rockefeller family's example of broad-minded philanthropy, or whether it was influenced by other corporations, different kinds of social responsibility strategies or so forth. They're down in a strategic crouch, ready to shoot first and ask questions later. I wonder. I mean, on the one hand, they would say, look at our numbers. What's wrong with what we're doing? But the answer is, I mean, part of the explanation for their numbers, of course, much of the explanation for their numbers is that the oil industry is a kind of utility that is pretty idiot-proof. If you can run it, if you can run an oil company reasonably well, you're going to make lots of money, at least in this price environment. They run their company better than most, so they make even more money, and they're enormous, so they have enormous benefits of scale. So is that durable? It has been durable. Will it be durable for another 30 or 40 years? There's a couple of reasons to question. One is Chad and the examples elsewhere in the book of their position in troubled societies, which is not going to change. The resource nationalism that drove them into these settings is not going away. Demonstrates, I think, and it's not the only example, but it's enough. The oil industry, the energy industry is increasingly a world of partnerships. It's hard to do it yourself anymore. You're going to have to partner with governments, you're going to have to partner with communities, non-governmental organizations, you're going to have to take account of the media. In this global environment where information is flat, available to everyone, you cannot hide in a box, and you can't be a bad partner. And they are seen as closed, and they're not seen by even their industry peers as good partners. They're prickly, arrogant, and headstrong. And that is not a prescription, I don't think, for success over 30 or 40 years in the world we're moving into, especially a world where American relative power is in decline. And the other factor is that we haven't talked about this, but in order to compete against the very largest state-owned oil companies in the world, because they're the largest corporation headquartered in the United States, but you make a list of oil companies worldwide, including those owned by governments, they're not even in the top 10. Their competitive advantage is science and technology and engineering. They compete with the Chinese in Africa by saying, we can do oil drilling that nobody else can do. We can do it in deeper water. We can do it in harsher climates. We can pipe it across landscapes that no one else can pipe it across. We can do that safely, and we can do it on time and on budget, and you'll make lots of money. And that claim, which is valid in general terms, reflects their ability to stay ahead of global competition on science, engineering, and geological exploration and insight. So they're a science company and an engineering company, maybe even more. Well, can you really attract and retain in the world? The Chinese are going to get better and better and better. The Russians are, may not get better and better and better because they're a political economy, but Indian and Chinese and other global Brazilian competition is going to rise. The quality of that competition is going to rise. Can they maintain their edge in with a workforce that is so close, so insular, unfriendly to women, not very globalized, not where people go home to their Thanksgiving dinner and say, "I work at Exxon," and everyone draws in their breath. You know, I mean, I don't. You know what scientists are like. They're not going to thrive if they can't open their windows a little bit. I think, and develop a talent culture that is a little bit less rigid than the one that they possess now. I mean, that's at least a question that I would ask. It does to an extent, although there I think that's at least inside the lines of what they do, which is energy. You know, so energy broadly defined. They're interested, I think, genuinely in watching the alternative energy space defensively. So they study it very carefully. They're an enormous incumbency that has a very profitable business model that presumes the role of oil in the transportation economy. They're naturally going to resist changes in technology that would threaten the primacy of oil fuels in the global transportation economy. That's a threat to them. But other kinds of changes in the energy economy that might be enacted for environmental reasons, particularly a price on carbon to address the dangers of global warming, they're already adjusting to that by partly by necessity and partly by choice, by shifting towards natural gas, which they see as a winner in a carbon-constrained 21st century. It's easier for them to access gas anymore than it is for them to access oil, so that they're making a virtue of a necessity to some extent by doubling down on gas. Also, the United States is, of course, in the midst of a potential kind of unconventional natural gas boom. That allows them to come back into the free market West and enjoy the property rights of ownership. If they can find the gas here, they can own it in an uncomplicated way. The political risk is different now. They have to deal with environmentalists who are concerned about the damage that fracking industrialization causes. So anyway, it's complicated. I think their view of alternatives is that they have an incumbent business that they like, and they don't want to run themselves out of business. As to wind and solar, that's a power generation story. They're not, gas puts them in the power generation business, but they don't want to be. I don't think there's any philosophical reason why they wouldn't incrementally go into power generation, whether it was hydro or geothermal or solar or wind. It doesn't threaten their business. It's just not what they don't see scale in it and profitability in it the way they see it in oil and gas. I think that's right. I mean, I think that there's a lot of incoherence in the politics of energy and energy policy, except that one very large, durable, coherent corporation is sitting right in the middle of our political economy, and they have coherence that the Department of Energy, the environmental movement, and other players, don't always have. I think there are probably a more practically important and effective representation of what our actual energy policy is than the Department of Energy is, for example, and their scale is larger. But on the environmental side, in the NGO world in general, there's an enormous amount of diversity and fragmentation. There's no question about it. There is not a galvanizing crisis or perception that is unifying the environmental movement or the NGO around common cause. It's not global warming because public opinion isn't there, in part because companies like ExxonMobil managed to sow doubts about the validity of climate science in its embryonic phase. There's not a perception that air pollution or water pollution or the risks of catastrophic oil spills or the risks of global warming pose an acute threat to living generations. That's when the American people, normally in their, sloppy, zigzagging sort of way, will very rapidly impose costs on themselves in order to address environmental problems. If the threat of air pollution or water pollution is documented to increase the risks that living family members will contract debilitating or fatal diseases, then you're willing to pay higher taxes. But if it's something that's a little more indirect and in the future, and you're not even sure what it really amounts to, as in global warming, then you're not willing to pay that price. And I think the only rationale for creating sustained changes in the way we price energy so as to incent the development of more sustainable alternatives, the only real rationale is global warming. I mean, you can make a case for energy independence and talk yourself into solar and wind, but it's a pretty indirect case because our oil imports are a problem for our trade deficit. But even if we didn't import a barrel of oil, we'd still be beholden to the Middle East for a lot of different reasons. So, I think what's interesting to me about the global warming problem as a political problem is that is this question of future versus living generations. Because in Australia, that's a country that's basically a coal mine. It's a giant natural resources economy. And they had politics that were deeply unfavorable to carbon pricing. And as we and the Australians were like the two outliers in the global system in our attitudes towards Kyoto and global warming. And they just enacted a carbon price. Why? They had a Labour government, but that didn't mean that they had enough of a parliament to get it through, just as Obama couldn't get it through. The reason, I think, is that they had the worst drought in 50 years, and it scared them. It basically, they have no topsoil. And I think they sort of said to themselves in some way, people did make this argument, this is not a future threat, it's here now. And if we don't start to take it seriously, we could end up acting too late to save Australia as a viable, sustainable community of 20 or 30 million, however many people live there. And that sense that it's arrived, that the threat is here, that it's meaningful, that it could affect current farmers and current livelihoods, that is absent in the United States. When will it come? We're living in very hot times. Yeah, I think the only, it's interesting, the Department of the Interior doesn't worry them. They captured that pretty thoroughly, as we saw in the Deepwater Horizon case. I think at the state and local level, especially in the southwestern politically friendly states where they produce a lot of the gas that they own, which otherwise could be environmentally problematic, they try to stay away from blue states. They don't own natural gas in New York for a reason, I think. I think the only regulatory agency that worries them and gets their attention, that is strong enough to compete with them, is the EPA. I think that's true in the energy industry generally. And now the EPA is a political organization that changes with the White House. And so that explains some of their alignment with the Republican Party and that of other oil and coal corporations. But the EPA is sort of this odd hybrid of both a political agency whose philosophy of regulation can be changed with the presidency, but also a permanent bureaucracy that has established its rules in law and then has its rules constantly ratified by the courts. So it's a big complex that sort of starts with whoever is in the White House, runs through the leadership of the EPA, then into the science-based durable bureaucracy of the EPA and then out into litigation, because everything is litigated that they do, and then established in court-supervised regimes. That's the actual energy regulation that ExxonMobil cannot defeat, has to live with, and constantly tries to influence, but I don't think they are as effective there as they are in many other areas of regulatory capture. Well, it changed their culture and changed the way they operate, because the executive who was rising to power at that time, Lee Raymond, used the crisis to remake the company. And he wanted to do some of this anyway, but he used the sort of trauma atmosphere and then the merger with Mobil to really re-engineer, and that's the right verb. They essentially created a engineering-led, rule-bound corporation driven by operating manuals, incredibly rigid, incredibly uniform, disciplined, tight, effective. And it wasn't just that they changed their procedures, which they did in every way, or wrote them all down in manuals so that everything you did at the workplace every day, you could consult a manual to determine exactly how you should do it. But that mentality, that approach, the force of discipline and accountability and documentation that was required to create those changes, it also influenced their outlook on everything. I think if you ask why did they have the communications and social responsibility strategies they had, it's because it flows from this engineering-led, one-size-fits-all, uniform approach to oil and gas operations in all their aspects. The funniest document I found in the Deepwater Horizon investigations was this spill response plan that all the super majors that were operating in the Gulf of Mexico had filed. And they all used the same consultant. They all filed the same plan. Of course, we will remediate this one. But Exxon had its own 40-page appendix that was unique to its filing that showed how to manage the media in the event of an accident. It had all kinds of press release scripts out. We deeply regret, and then fill in the blank here. And it just showed, so their idea of how to deal with communities in a crisis where oil may be spilling into fisheries and businesses may be upended and not only wildlife but conceivably people could be endangered. And their idea is that, okay, let's think that through in advance and write down every word we might speak in that setting. That's how it changed the company. PR is engineering too. Yeah. I think that's true. I think that's true in the sense that this is a kind of bet the company every day kind of business. So if you're not really under meaningful regulatory pressure, if that's not your experience of the risks of managing risk, then you do internalize it. And if you didn't have that $20 billion fine hanging over your head, which you know is coming if you fail to self-regulate adequately and you blow off a Macondo kind of accident, then yeah, it's pretty good motivation. But as you say, the dilemma, if you're writing a novel, you want your protagonist to have a dilemma. So ExxonMobil's dilemma is that they are this company that has tried to wring all human fallibility out of their daily operations, but their business model is driving them inexorably into risk. So they're being driven into political risk in the ways that we've discussed. They're also being driven into operating risk because they have to operate in more and more frontier environments. So they can say, oh, we know how to do it. But the truth is that a lot of these wells under that kind of pressure, in those kinds of operating environments, in Arctic ice, in cold water, in harsh climates, in very deep water, in frontier geology, even fracking, which Exxon, of course, talks about very confidently. The truth is that nobody knows what happens when you frack on this scale of industrial operation because it hasn't been done before. I mean, maybe it's harmless, but it hasn't been done before. And so they're constantly out on risk frontiers while trying to wring all risk out of their operations. Yeah, it's not. In the energy area, we are not organized to actually govern ourselves in proportion to the risks that we are collectively undertaking. That's my view. We're just not organized. I mean, there are other areas where we're reasonably well organized to do that. I mean, the defense of our shores against attack. I mean, we've gotten ourselves over-organized, if anything, about that. But it's a funny thing because there are sections of the energy economy that are reasonably well supervised and organized, and electricity generation, for example, at the regional level, though it's been deregulated over the last 15 years, is probably more at risk than it used to be. Between the rise of the public utility commissions and the electrification of rural America, and the long run in which it was recognized that electricity provision is so fundamental to quality of life, health, and the economy that it simply cannot be left to the kinds of haphazard, self-regulating market forces that we see in the oil industry. And so we developed a public interest standard, a whole system of regulated, mixed private-public enterprise approaches to this with a universal service standard as part of the compact. And the government systems that arose up out of that, they're expensive, they're inefficient, they didn't always produce but they basically built the infrastructure that allowed for this postmodern industrialization of the United States, reindustrialization of the United States through the computer industry, the information industry, telecommunications industry. Until recently, we kind of lost our grip, but for 50 years, it was a pretty good system. Now, oil is just a funny thing because it is a utility. You go to the gas pump, you drive a car, you can't get out of your relationship with gasoline. We don't approach it with public interest standard in mind. Maybe. I mean, I was on a panel last night with the former president of Shell USA, and we were having a conversation similar to this, and I said I don't see where the change comes from unless it's a crisis that's really large scale. When we got 9/11, we got the Department of Homeland Security. Now, I'm not sure the Department of Homeland Security is better than what we had before, but there was a reorganization of federal authority, and it's certainly more powerful than it was before. And he was advocating for a single Federal Reserve-inspired regulatory agency that would consolidate the 13 cabinet offices that now regulate the oil and gas industry and the 25 different, that there would be like an SEC, Federal Reserve-inspired, non-political, independent regulatory agency that would govern energy and environmental regulation around energy in one strong shop, in part to actually match the potential of the regulated corporations. Now, it's interesting that someone like him would conceive of such a solution, but as you say, it's very hard to imagine where the politics for that come from unless there is an enormous crisis. Yeah. And the oil industry is creating these behemoths because of the sheer scale of profitability that utility function creates. I mean, ExxonMobil is the largest corporation on the Fortune 500 list. Two of the other top five are oil companies, Chevron and Conoco. I mean, who thinks about Conoco every day? Chevron is, I think, third or fourth, and ExxonMobil's revenues are twice as great as Chevron's, and that's just within the top five of the Fortune 500. So just putting your mind around the scale of these institutions takes some doing, and all of that flows into our regulatory system and our political system. Yeah, we had that shock in the banking and the Wall Street system, and we got Dodd-Frank and maybe some revival of Glass-Steagall, and there'll still be a contest between regulators and the banks, but at least we're having the right conversation about too big to fail and systemic risk. In the oil industry, we're not. So the question is, again, what kind of a shock would create? You wouldn't necessarily want to live through that crisis, but I think it's likely over the next 20 years that there will be multiple catastrophic environmental accidents, and some of them will be very vivid north of the Arctic Circle. We're going to have a big wreck up there, and it's going to be ugly. And I don't know whether that will galvanize the majorities in the lower 48. Fracking also, I don't think is a story that's finished yet. It does, and part of course, what you see in banking is that you would also see in energy, and it was true in the Department of the Interior when you look at the specific regulatory regimes that surrounded Gulf deepwater drilling in the years leading up to the Deepwater Horizon accident. Just read the National Commission report. Is that federal civil service is just not up to overseeing the degree of complexity and wealth that it is charged to oversee. I mean, it just doesn't have the capacity to keep up with the derivatives traders and the speed algorithm writers on Wall Street, and it doesn't have the capacity to keep up with the degree of complex engineering and interdisciplinary project management that's going on these offshore oil platforms. And if you did have the human capacity, industry would immediately hire it. So. Right. Well, I think what's realistic, if I were king, would be to identify those utility functions that are essential to the national economy, to society, to an equal, just, and accessible economy, and ring-fence those, and force the corporations out of risk profiles in those areas, and then manage the risk profiles without any too big to fail institutions and without any catastrophic risk on the periphery of those core utility functions. The problem, obviously, in Wall Street was that we mixed our deposit banking system with, a bet the company, global derivative speed, algorithm writing financial system, and there's no reason why we should do that. If you want to, if Citigroup is prepared to provide retail deposit banking and lending, commercial lending services, without intermingling its viability as an institution with that side of the house, so it's back to Glass-Steagall there. And there's an analogy in the oil industry, which is we should determine what is the utility function in our energy economy, ring-fence that, regulate it carefully, and if we have to exclude environmentally risky activity in the continental United States, we should evaluate what the costs of excluding that are. But we shouldn't kid ourselves into thinking that we're going to be able to provide oversight on these frontier environments that's going to be meaningful to these companies. Either we accept the fact that they're self-regulating out of fear of failure because of the costs they would pay, the $20 billion fine, either we accept that as the risk equation we're going to undertake with some relatively light oversight, or we ban the activity. We do both right now. We're not really sure. We both ban it and we lightly regulate it.